morning, everybody. Very happy to be able to present this to you. It's sort of one of those things that I got involved in a few years ago, and I'll tell you about the history of all this, but it's also one of the things that you learn a lot about on your way to learning about something else. So I hope that you appreciate the talk this morning, and I look forward to your questions as well. First, some objectives, if my screen will move forward. There we go. At the end of the session, I hope that we can meet these objectives. They're not too difficult, and I think we can get there. And beyond that, I just want to offer a disclaimer. Menstruation is not my lived experience, but I have spent a lot of time around people who menstruate, and some of my best friends are or were menstruators. So that said, we can sort of move on with the bulk of the presentation. I have no disclosures to share this morning. And I'm going to begin with a question regarding the evolution of menses. And this talk will sort of basically have three sections, a little bit about evolution of menses, the physiology, and then some of the work we're doing in menstrual science. So here's the first question. And I just wait, Dakeen, I suppose.
Yes, sorry, hold on. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm having trouble. People are answering.
In the chat or something?
No, they're answering, but they're answering.
Yeah, all five questions
came up. Oh, dear.
Well, that's okay. Maybe we can go to the answers as we get to the other.
People said bats.
Okay. Well, you are wrong. The species that actually does not menstruate, or at least technically not menstruate, are whales. The elephant shrew, which is the closest living relative to the elephant, which is about the size of a groundhog, actually menstruates, and many bat species menstruate in addition to humans, but whales do not actually menstruate because menstrual flow into the water would be like a feeding fest for sharks. So whales do not actually menstruate. Everything is actually reabsorbed into the body. It's not estrus, it's a cycle, but they don't actually have a menstrual flow. Next question was this one, here, about how menstruation actually evolved. And I'm interested to hear, I won't address the group's answer. I just want to see what people think at the present time. Which one of these is the most correct answer in terms of how menstruation evolved?
Okay, you've got 83% as a C, as a result of spontaneous decidualization. Okay,
I'm hoping your slide says as a consequence of embryo-generated decidualization, but that's because that's.
It didn't. That's
okay.
My
so
bad.
I see. It was another form of the question. That's okay. We'll move on and we'll get to this discussion later. So let's just review a little bit about the history of menstruation. The ancient Greeks thought that menstruation was a cosmic event linked to the moon and lunar cycles, and that's where the word really comes from. Mene is the Greek word for moon, and mensis is Latin for month. So all of this makes sense. And of course, you know, a lunar cycle is 28 days. And I don't know about wherever you were, but we just had the most amazing full moon here in New Mexico a couple of days ago. But I hope you all enjoyed that moon too. But this is at least the etymology of the word for menses and for menstruation. And then looking at some of the history, we'll spend a little time on history because this is some of the things that I certainly learned on my way to learning something else. This is one of the most interesting things, that the practice of bleeding people to cure them actually may have originated with Hippocrates. You know, there's all these famous scenes of the leeches and people being bled basically to death because they thought that bleeding was the way to get rid of the evil humors. But Hippocrates began this practice apparently after observing that women were relieved of bloating, aches, and pains with the onset of their menses. So that was the origin of that. Of course, Hippocrates also thought that the uterus wandered around in the body. And this is also the origin of the word for hysterical or hysteria, hyster being the Greek root for uterus. But I thought that was kind of an interesting origin of how menstruation actually led to one of the biggest misunderstandings in the history of medicine. Pliny the Elder, who was one of the first writers on the concept of natural history, had these views about menstruation and about women during menstruation. And this is really, you know, one of the first documents we have about the origins of menstrual stigma, which, as many of you realize, still exists very much today. So Pliny wrote that on the approach of a woman in the state, will become sour. Seeds were touched become sterile, and agricultural grafts, which they had in his day, wither away. Garden plants are parched up. Fruit will fall from the tree beneath which she sits. Her very look even will dim the brightest of mirrors, blunt the edge of steel, take away the polish from ivory. And the Romans were very big on ivory after the elephant troops came across from Carthage. And a swarm of bees, if looked upon by her, will die immediately. Now, maybe he was onto something with the swarm of bees, because as many of you know, we have a real bee problem right now. And maybe the last decades of incessant ovulation and more menstruation is having an effect on the bees. We don't know. But Pliny actually died in the eruption of Vesuvius, which was, of course, a different kind of flow. And most people, at least in some parts of the world, remember him now mainly by the beer that's named after him. Now, religion has played a big role in people's thinking about menstruation. And I have here Talmudic Judaism, but Talmudic Judaism actually came after really biblical era Judaism. But this is what is in the Talmud and in with its origins in the Old Testament. So no sex was allowed for the duration of any bleeding, which, if you allow for a few days of spotting after, let's just say, an average period of 7 days, this means that when the woman emerges from a period of prohibited sex, she's exactly at the right time of the month to conceive. So they weren't really stupid. They kind of understood that part. But during menses, menstruators were considered ritually impure. And this has then extended to a number of other of the Judeo-Christian religions, including Islam. You cannot attend the ritual bath. You cannot attend a religious service. And anything on which a menstruating woman sat or rested was also considered impure. And this is part of the reason, and this is likely the origin of the so-called red tent, or the menstrual hut, which in some parts of the world still exists. But this one I also found interesting. A person on their period couldn't even hand an object to their spouse without that object needing to be re-blessed by the rabbi. Now, cynical me, knowing a little bit how it works with asking a rabbi to bless something, historically, there's kind of a gratuity involved. And you can imagine that if women or families were coming all the time to have something re-blessed by the rabbi because it had become impured, tainted, then that might have been a pretty good side living there. Now, the early church continued some of these proscriptions. So, and I'm just showing you a picture of Notre Dame, which many of us will be visiting in the next week or so. Women could not take Holy Communion during, quote, their time of the month, and couples should refrain from sexual intercourse. Now, in sort of, I almost say typical magical thinking, the church held that any children born to people who had intercourse during menstruation would be red-haired and puny. So I don't know how Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, was conceived, but he had red hair. She was red-haired and not very large, but she had a pretty considerable empire. But amazingly, and if you really want a guy not to do something, if you said it could damage the penis on contact with menstrual flow, then you get people to comply. So a little bit about that history. But this has continued into Victorian times. And here's a description from a textbook by Walter Heap in 1897 with a very typical Victorian description, and with rife with pathological descriptions. At the end of each cycle, the lining of the uterus is cast away, leaving behind a ragged wreck of tissue, torn glands, ruptured vessels, jagged edges of stroma, and masses of blood corpuscles, which it would seem hardly possible to heal satisfactorily without the aid of surgical treatment. Please recall that the word curette, as from curettage, literally means to clean, and it was not unheard of for women to have D&Cs occasionally just for the purposes of cleaning the endometrium. But this has led to continuing surrounding attitudes around menstruation and menses. This is from a book, an anthropological text in 1989. Menstruation not only carries with it the connotation of a productive system that has failed to produce, it also carries the idea of production gone awry, making products of no use, not to specification, unsaleable, wasted scrap. And this concept of waste and scrap becomes very important in terms of even some of the challenges that we've had recently in working with menstrual blood. But this is a good one too. And this is from a text by a physician writing in 1968 on a sort of a tome, Living, Loving, and Marrying, which was basically commissioned by the Mormon Church. And I remember actually that last line, the second bullet there, David Grimes used to talk about that all the time. But no honeymoon in the uterus awaits the unfertilized egg. She will tumble from the body alone, her eyes wide with terror, reaching back with her small egg hands toward the chute that ejected her. And menstruation is the weeping of a disappointed womb when pregnancy does not occur. And here's an illustration from that book, Living, Loving, Marrying, from 1968. So the answer to the origin of how menstruation actually evolved is kind of interesting, because it appears that it's one of the few evolutionary developments that does not appear to have an a priori adaptive benefit. Rather, it appears to be the consequence of other things. So these things basically happened, which ultimately engendered menstruation. Number one, the development of placental invasiveness. Number two, the necessity of an immune privileged state during pregnancy. And three, and this is, I think, perhaps the most important one, the high rate of chromosomal anomalies amongst humans because of our complicated genome means that we needed a means of limiting maternal investment in a, quote, bad embryo. And I mean, I think both Ruth Lottie and Virginia Wynn could probably say a lot more about these components of the evolution of menstruation than I can. But there are others who thought over time that it was to allow for spontaneous decidualization, which is what humans do, as opposed to embryo generated decidualization, which is prevalent in most of the rest of the mammalian world. But it appears in recent literature, and this is from an essay in 2012, that it's the nature of our invasive placenta and our complicated genome that we needed to be able to limit our investment and at the same time get ready for the next opportunity to reproduce. Now here I want to take a little break. Let's make sure I'm on the right page here. Yeah. So here I want to take a moment to talk about the editorial process and when you're asked to be a reviewer. Now you can see in the corner here, this is the title, and the title of today's Grand Rounds actually was taken from this editorial that Nicole Tyson, Olga Chuk, and myself wrote in response to a paper that appeared in the BMJ Sexual and Reproductive Health, which I'll review later in this talk. But as an associate editor, and I'm sure many of you know this as well, it is very hard to find reviewers for papers. Everybody says, oh, I don't have time. I have too many deadlines. I don't know anything about this. But I want to make a plea to you all to think about being a reviewer, to accept the review. You don't have to know a lot of statistics. Journals have statistical editors. You are all content experts, subject matter experts. And what we say in terms of wisdom and perspective basically generates the body of knowledge to which we comply and which becomes our body of knowledge. And in this case of this paper, which we'll review later, which had to do with the capacities of menstrual hygiene products, I was at a loss to find reviewers. Nicole graciously agreed to become a reviewer, and we both thought that the paper was good enough and interesting enough to merit an editorial. And every time I review a paper now, or when it's in my editorial or my associate editor's queue, I think about the possibility of an editorial all the time. And all of you could be editorial writers or contributors. Journals actually like editorials. Editors like editorials. It actually increases the impact factor of a journal. So I'm just putting out a plea to accept invitations to review. And when you review, think about whether you have something passionate you want to say about the subject matter. The paper itself is always a jumping off point to a broader discussion of the big issue that the paper, upon which that paper may have touched. And that's exactly what Nicole and Olga and I did in this editorial. And I refer you to this editorial because it's really a very wide-ranging discussion of all kinds of issues that we face around menstruation. And while we focus on the paper that was published, we really do talk about a wide variety of issues. One of the things we brought up in this editorial was that menstrual blood is really, or menstruation in general, is understudied and unstandardized. Nicole, I think, came up with the fact that there was only one publication with the search term menstrual blood between 1941 and 1950. And then there was a steady increase to and a plateau of only 400 publications in the last several decades. But during the same time, there were approximately 10,000 papers or publications related to erectile dysfunction. Now, where's the justice? But what's also interesting in terms of this issue about being understudied is that it's only in 2005 that FIGO called for common language to define the regularity, frequency, duration, and volume of menstrual cycles, 2005. And in 2013, ACOG publishes standard terminologies for study protocols to investigate normal and abnormal menstruation. That is very recent when you really think about it. So this is one of the definitions that has surfaced pretty recently about menstruation. And I like it because it combines two important components: the shedding of the superficial lining of the uterine endometrium, which is a physiologic mechanical event, and also this brings in the fact that menstruation is actually sterile. We're going to come back to that point in a second, but is also associated in a reduction in progesterone. And that's the part that's very unique to humans and other menstruating species, in that it's the progesterone that decidualizes the endometrium, whether or not conception occurs. And it's the drop in progesterone, as you well know, that eventually results in the shedding of the endometrial lining. So I find that a very good working definition of menstruation. But, you know, we live in an era of social change, and I think a lot of these social changes and norms are going to drive future research and attitudes, or vice versa. And here's some examples of that. So I came across this ad, and if you can't read the print, but this is Allie McGraw when she was much younger, and who actually I have to say, and those of you who know my wife might know that she looked almost, was a dead ringer for Allie McGraw when she was in high school. But this is an ad for a tampon. And if you can't really read the text here, it says, you're dying to get the job. You sat in the waiting room all morning for this interview. You're getting nervous about your tampon. What do you do? And this was an advertisement for the job hunting tampon from Playtex. Well, you know, period anxiety and menstrual anxiety is very much a real thing, and it continues to today, but so do a lot of weird attitudes about menses. And here's another one. I don't know if you saw these headlines. This was taken from CNN. This is just a year or so ago, maybe, where this golfer, this professional golfer, I think she's golfer number 3 in the world, Lydia Ko, was noted at a tournament to be getting a massage, a back massage. And a reporter came up to her and said, "What's wrong? Are you injured? Are you injured? Is that why you're getting massage?" And she said, "No, dude, it's just that time of the month." And this reporter was absolutely speechless, had no idea what she could possibly be talking about, but this made headlines. But the other one that was more recent and followed the bouncing ball here was a headline also, I think, in CNN, where during the recent Women's World Cup soccer tournament, women's soccer teams ditched white shorts at the World Cup in a move aimed at, oh, sorry about the typo, at reducing period anxiety. Again, this leads me in a good segue to the next question, which relates to one of the papers I want to review with you, is the next question of which of these products has the highest absorptive capacity in terms of blood. And Dakeen, can you share the answer with us, or the responses?
Yeah, we've got 60% menstrual cups, 10% menstrual discs, 20% tampons, 40% pads, 10% underwear. Okay, well, here's the paper that that sort of stimulated both our editorial and in part this talk. And it related to the red blood cell capacity of modern menstrual products, considerations for assessing heavy menstrual bleeding. Now, this paper, and some of my colleagues at Stanford will recognize Alyssa Colwell and Allie Edelman as 2 of the authors who are in the Division of Family Planning at Oregon. And these other 2 authors are internists in hematology. But this paper actually scientifically and rigorously reviewed menstrual product capacities. And this was picked up widely by news outlets. Here's just a photo from one of the issues of The Guardian, in which it talked about this whole process, or this whole paper, but also the relative underutilization of science to assess menstruation. And here are the actual results of the paper in graph form. So you can see that the menstrual disc actually did have the biggest capacity of any of these other products. Menstrual underwear are basically useless. And pads and tampons, pads were a little better, especially the super maxi ones. And I'll show you more specific data in just a second. But menstrual cups were not quite as good as the menstrual discs, which are
actually a product more recently devised than menstrual cups. And here's some of the actual data. And let's just go to the bottom line here first. You can see that the menstrual underwear had a capacity of 3 cc's. And the large one was no different than the small one. Oops, let me go back here. Then if you look at tampons, they compared a variety of brands. And what they actually did was they used expired packed red blood cells to assess this. This was not the way that most menstrual hygiene products have been advertised in the past by the industry, where they just use water. Similar to the ads for paper towels, where they pour water on it and they say, okay, this is the quicker picker-upper. But I think most of you realize that blood is not water. And so one of the really unique things about this paper was they actually used expired packed red blood cells. They had a very rigorous way of dripping the blood onto these various products and then assessing their capacity to avoid leakage or before leakage occurred. So you can see that the heavy brands of the tampons held about 34 cc's or mLs. The discs up to 80 in one brand and 63 in another. And then you can see the cups a little bit less. So the cups were actually were about the same as a heavy pad, although the regular pad was less. But the menstrual underwear was really, I don't know, kind of useless. Now, I think in our review of the paper, we had some criticisms, which are mentioned briefly in our editorial, but, we asked them, well, why didn't you use whole blood? And as most of us now recognize, whole blood is actually very hard to find because the way that blood is provided and dispensed clinically, it's either red blood cells or plasma and fractionations, et cetera. So packed red blood cells were certainly better than water, and that was what they decided to use, which I thought was a really, really good move. And in terms of the bottom line, which maybe is an ill-advised title for this slide, I really thought that this paper and what the authors were also getting at was at least having knowledge of menstrual pad product or menstrual product capacity based on actual evidence could help menstruators choose the right product for themselves. Heavy bleeders can know the best product for their needs, which is what the authors were really getting at. And given the expense of these products, and this is something that Nicole and Olga and I brought up in the editorial, evidence-based choices means better cost efficiency for people. We all know that these products are expensive, and there is a certain degree of period poverty that people experience. And why aren't these products covered by insurance? And the other thing that I thought about in this was that we have standards for all kinds of things in our society. Menstrual product capacity should be one of them. We should have a standard for what hygiene products can provide for us. And I use this example of, here's something for which we do have a standard. There is actually a standard for hot peppers. This is called the Scoville scale. And you can measure you can actually know how hot a pepper you're getting into, because these units, which are somehow related to reactions of taste buds, are actually, there is a standardized score for this. And we should have the same for menstrual product capacity. Now, there's more. A few years ago, I got a call from Sarah Nasseri, who was at the time a Danish medical student. She cold calls me while I'm on a duty travel, travel in Botswana on a project. And she calls me and wants to study the clinical utility of menstrual blood for HPV. She said that she was referred to me by Jonathan Court, who many of you will remember as both a resident and then an REI fellow, who in talking with her assures her, oh, Blumenthal, he'll try anything. And then she says, oh, and by the way, we have a proposal due to the Danish government tomorrow. So we talked for a little while, and I said, well, first of all, I don't I don't know that I want to study HPV right away. I don't want people calling me every month with an HPV result or asking for an HPV result. But we did submit this grant to the Danish government. We did not get it. However, you know, again, in advocating for people who do write grants, don't worry about not getting a grant. Now you've done the intellectual heavy lifting, you can now shop that grant proposal around. And in the same way that one of my mentors told me that the only reason not to get a paper accepted by a journal is not having enough postage in the day when you actually sent papers to journals in the mail. I think, you know, if you just keep trying like Edison with a proposal, it'll eventually come through. So in 2017, Sarah becomes a visiting student researcher and then a visiting scholar with us at Stanford. And what's interesting in terms of the small world component of this is that one of the guys who was reviewing the proposal for the Danish government happened to be a senior associate dean for research at Stanford, who I happen to know from Hopkins. And when he saw this application come through for the visiting scholar, he was actually very supportive of it because he remembered the paper that he liked, the proposal that he actually liked to the Danish government, and accepted Sarah as first a visiting student researcher and then a visiting scholar. So we began studies of several analytes of clinical interest with menstrual blood. And based on these initial results, hemoglobin A1C emerges as a top candidate for more focused investigation, also laid the groundwork for menstrual blood HPV study, which we did at Stanford. And this really was the beginning of a beautiful relationship, friendship, and we continue to do investigations into a variety of aspects of clinical utility of menstrual blood. But there are challenges to this. And in terms of harking back to what I mentioned before about menstrual blood or the menstrual process being sterile, it was not easy to find a lab that would actually let us analyze menstrual blood. And, you know, I'm going to protect well, they're not exactly innocent, but I'm going to protect people's names here. But we approached the clinical lab director at a major university medical center, asking him if we could do a study to compare menstrual blood versus serum. And his exact words were, "I'm not letting you put that skanky stuff in my machines." And we were shocked. We actually then even offered to spin it all down for him and then submit it just as serum, which was indistinguishable serum from menstrual serum from venous serum. But he was adamant he would not allow us to use the clinical facilities at the menstrual center for this work. We did find a lab. First, we found a lab in San Diego and then another one in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places. The other challenge was that menstrual cups and discs and conventional pads were really not conducive to specimen collection or processing. There was kind of an ick factor, especially for people who are going to be storing things for a while until they would bring them into us. But one of the unique, and that of course led to the next sort of discovery or invention, which I'm going to share with you. But unique to our catchment area, we had a very high penetration of LNG IUD users who don't bleed. And so it was actually kind of a chore to do a lot of advertising and really be present in the clinic to find people who are coming in for colposcopy and for routine exams who were not on an LNG IUD, who would have a period, and we could compare their serum and menstrual blood results. So this is the device that Sarah and her partner at the company they started called QVIN, QVIN, developed. And this is an all-cotton pad that has an embedded collection device here. It's a little strip. And this removable stick or strip contains a dried blood spot that can then be sent to the lab. I'm sure that most of you know what a dried blood spot is, but if you don't, and you've ever watched a detective story on TV, let's say Special Victims Unit, and they go to the scene of the crime and there's some blood splatter on the wall, and they take a little forceps or whatever, they scrape it off the wall and into the envelope. That's a dried blood spot, and that's how they can uncover the identity of the perpetrator. That said, this strip, the Q strip, because we call this the Q pad for Quinn, this strip contains the dried blood spot, and this strip can then be snipped. And all you really need for to analyze most analytes is about 5 microliters. Now, this may start to sound a little bit like Theranos, but we've done a lot more due diligence than she did. But it's also interesting that the dried blood spot, unlike trying to send the effluent from a menstrual cup or a disc or even a pad through the mail or a tampon, it's not a dried blood spot is not a hazardous material. You can just put it in an envelope and send it in the mail, which makes it much more convenient to get to a lab and to study. So we then embarked on a variety of studies of menstrual blood for screening and diagnostic and therapeutic purposes. And here is the official emoji. Mark your emoji calendars or whatever. This is the official emoji for menstruation or menstrual blood. And here's some results. Well, here's what we hypothesized. And I think the real spoiler here is that, menstrual blood is blood. Who would have thunk it? So, and it really could have utility in screening or for conditions such as cervical cancer, HIV, STIs, diabetes, thyroid status, hemoglobin, and a variety of other things that we're only beginning to really understand. So here is the last question, I think, for today. Which of these analytes does menstrual blood not correlate with serum? And Dakeen, top 5 answers on the board?
Okay, we have cholesterol at 20%, hemoglobin at 40%, FSH at 10%, and glucose at 30%. So the top one is hemoglobin.
So very interesting answers. And the real answer is glucose. When we first started studying this, if a serum glucose was, let's just say 90, the menstrual glucose was 5. That shows you how efficient the bacteria in the vagina really are at, if you'll forgive me, feeding or getting nutrition for themselves from menstrual blood. That is amazing bacterial efficiency in the vagina. I will now show you the data from the other analytes that we have been studying. And so here you see a graph of a variety of analytes, which was in our first paper published in 2019 in a clinical laboratory journal. And you can see, just looking at these lines, that it's pretty visible that for most of these analytes, there is pretty direct correlation between menstrual blood and serum. And if you look at, and the other interesting thing is that there's not much bias, and I'll show you more about that in a second. There's not much bias in terms of whether is menstrual blood always higher or always lower. No, if it's sort of a random event, so there's very little bias in terms of whether menstrual blood will be higher or lower than venous blood. And you can see for hemoglobin A1C, it's very tight. It's a very tight correlation. And FSH is very good. And cortisol, the reason there may be some spread with cortisol is because of diurnal variations in cortisol and the period of time over which the menstrual blood may have been collected, morning or evening, and when the blood was drawn. So there may be an answer for there about a little bit of the spread, but you can see for most of these analytes, it's pretty darn tight. If we then look a little further, and here, this one really did surprise me. This was, well, A1C is also very tight, and with an R of 0.98, I think you can really take menstrual hemoglobin A1C to the bank in terms of asking people to submit a Q strip and get an answer to your diabetes control well before you actually have to, see the physician. And I'm going to talk about that again in just another minute. This one was the one that really surprised me, is that hemoglobin is bang on. There's no bias. There's a very high correlation. And hemoglobin, menstrual blood can be a very accurate reflection of what's going on systemically. In terms of HPV, this is the screenshot from the page of the title page of our paper in the Green Journal from 2022, which Kate mentioned in her introduction. And our objectives here are to assess the QPAD versus clinician-collected and self-collected high-risk HPV concordance, and to assess the acceptability of the QPAD. This study was pretty rigorous, and we purposefully involved both a clinician-collected swab, which is basically when we obtaining a pap smear, so it was involved a speculum exam, or a self-collected swab. And then they collected menstrual blood at home using the QPAD, which I just showed you. And then the specimens were shipped to a CLIA-certified lab and analyzed using the COBAS system, which is going to be very shortly approved for primary cervical cancer screening with HPV. These are our results. And the numbers for some of these things, partly due to our population at Stanford, are low. But when there was CIN2+, the QPAD had 100% correlation with the pap smear, or the clinician-collected swab. In terms of how they correlated, if the QPAD was collected within 2 months, and we were doing this in the middle of the pandemic, we had a 94, almost 95% correlation. The self-collected swabs did not correlate quite as well. And in addition, there were almost 25 to 30% of patients who refused to self-swab because they were uncomfortable with the procedure. And that's partly why we call this a passive self-collected menstrual blood, because there's nothing that the person really needs to do. The specimen comes to them. They don't have to actually go and get the specimen. And I'm sure it doesn't surprise any of you that patients preferred the QPAD to a clinician-collected swab, getting up on a table, a speculum exam, et cetera, by overwhelming margins. The Stanford Daily, a very highly respected editorial entity, said that period blood may be as effective as systemic blood for the diagnosis of disease. And if it says so in the Stanford Daily, it must be true. And then we've now embarked on a multi-center study, which has an N of about 300 people. And actually, in our study, in both of these studies, we used what we call an enriched sample, which means people who we knew were HPV positive, and then people about whom we had no idea. So we would make sure we had plenty of negatives. And we have now 98% agreement between menstrual blood and clinician-collected samples. And interestingly enough, the main difference is that menstrual blood samples were positive when the pap specimen was negative. Excuse me. And we think the reason for that might be because as blood flows through the cervix, it may be picking up HPV that's a little higher up than the cervical swab goes during a routine sample collection. And this may be especially of interest in nulliparous or young women who are needing to be screened. And importantly, again, all patients shown to have high-grade disease were positive on the QPAD. We're not the only people doing this. And I was surprised to find out that there are a number of centers around the world that are doing this. And you can see their correlations, which are very similar to ours, from China, from Hong Kong, from Wuhan, China, from Korea, and in rural India. And you can see here the various products that they're using, none of them as elegant or as probably as user-friendly as the QPAD for specimen collection, but interest worldwide and very similar results. There are a number of companies that are actually looking at menstrual blood in this domain for purposes of health maintenance in general. One is in the Bay Area called NextGen. They're using a tampon, and you have to remove the tampon, put it in a container, and then send it to the company by FedEx. They're mainly looking at infertility and adenomyosis. Another company, Life Story Health, it's kind of unclear what they're studying. I've been to their website. I mean, how they're collecting blood. I think they're just collecting it in pads, but they're interested in lung, breast, and endometrial cancer. There is a group at Northwell in New York who are looking at endometriosis. ROSE is an acronym for something, but I just can't remember what it stands for right now. But they're using sponges and cups, and they're looking at endometriosis. And there's a German company called Blut or Blood, and they have Check, which is really looking at menstrual health. And this is a company that's looking more at the menstrual biome, the menstrualome, than actual the correlation between blood and serum. So far, we're about the only group that are looking at actual comparing serum with menstrual blood for purposes of the clinical visit or clinical assessments. And I think that from my perspective, these are the real clinical and programmatic implications. This could be very cost effective because once eluted from the Q strip, which is relatively simple, involves a buffer and et cetera, the test itself is no more expensive than conventional tests. But what it does do, it eliminates a lot of the opportunity costs and clinic-related costs, clinic consumables, instrument processing, et cetera. It actually costs money. Every time we use an instrument in the clinic, there is a fee that the hospital charges us to process those instruments. And it is not inconsequential. But more importantly, from my perspective, it could turn conventional exploration visits into solutions visits. And what do I mean by that? Ordinarily, when a patient comes to us for a visit, we might do a physical exam, which in my view is increasingly useless, and we might collect some blood or a pap smear or whatever, and we send that all to the lab, and then we have to contact the patient later to talk with them about what we found. And maybe that's another visit, or at least a video visit, or a bunch of emails. Whereas if a patient were, for example, to send us or send to the lab the Q strip, and we could analyze all kinds of things, ranging from sexually transmitted infections to HPV to A1C, FSH, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, AMH can be measured as well. Then when the patient comes for her visit, having sent this to the lab in advance, because, if I call now and want to visit, it's going to be 3 months from next Thursday. We have plenty of time to get that specimen to us. And then the visit becomes what we call a solutions visit. We know exactly what the next steps need to be. And it's a much more productive visit than, well, I'm going to send you to the lab and I'll let you know what the results are. So I think this is one of the most programmatic implications of this research. In the future, we too want to look at endometriosis, ovarian and endometrial cancer, and really look at longitudinal assessments of the menstrualome. And I think that if we were to look at things like even CA125, which is relatively nonspecific, but year after year, we always measured it during menstruation, and it was always about the same, then all of a sudden, if 1 year it rises above sort of the confidence limit of that person's own menstrualome, then something might be going on, because the menstrual period itself is kind of a steady state. But I think the harder thing is going to be behavior change. We have very high acceptability of this approach in every time we've done it, but can we actually change clinician behavior, and can policymakers, the FDA, decision makers, insurance companies be motivated to use data to make decisions? So I thank you for your attention. Thank you and good night. And here's one of the remaining B's that Pliny was worried about. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions.